Oh, recording in progress. Well, there we go. Hi, Dagna. Welcome.
Hi, I guess I'll change my name.
I was like, who's LWV? Now
Yeah,
I
who
know
is
with the
that? Who
context.
is that? Yeah,
Well, after I say hello, I'm gonna go ahead and unmute you. When audience
right.
members come in, I'll be muting folks, but feel free to use the chat if you have any feedback or questions. It's just that this will be recorded and we'll be sharing it later, so uh, that will help it be a more useful and streamlined recording and help keep the focus on Idra, our special guest.
With our special librarian.
Oh, you you are too kind. I was just saying today, I was like, I'm being spoiled this year with you because not all authors are as kind and generous with their time and talent as you've been. So we're all very appreciative of that as well.
Oh, well, they're fools.
I would like to think that it's a you scratch my back, I scratch yours kind of deal, you know.
But I feel like it's such a joy to connect with people who've devoted their life to literature. I mean, you're keeping the music of literature going. You're like the Pied Pipers.
Oh, thank you. We're gonna consider that stolen, the Pied Pipers of literature. Well, so for those of you who are tuning in, my name is Michael Maxwell. I'm the Reader Services Librarian here at the Sioux City Public Library. And today we're kind of talking about this year 2024's Sioux City Reads book, which was voted on by you, Sioux City. And the winning title was Take What You Need, written by Idra Novey. And we are lucky enough today to be joined by Idra Novey herself from Brooklyn. So joining us from the East Coast, thank you so much for being here today. I think I will go ahead and let you introduce yourself to Sioux City.
Well, thank you, Michael, and thank you, Maddie, and everyone at the library who has shared this book with your community. And I was so moved by the mural and that 50 painters took part. And as Michael and I were saying before we came on, that I think what really was important to me with this novel was that Jean didn't wait for a memo to make her art. And I didn't never studied fiction formally. I just I studied other things, but I didn't study translation formally. You don't have to get a memo to make your art, write your book, follow your passion. And so to see all these people coming together and publicly making art collaboratively, I just think it was, it's just, I love that this book had a role in making that happen.
Well, the book made it easy. I'll say that. I think there's so much inspiration to take from a book, and it's so impactful for a novel of its size too, as well. I was so impressed by the breadth of what this novel does. And so it kind of made me think, sort of in line with what you're saying, what was the seed for Take What You Need? Like since nobody gave you permission to write the book, I would assume, right? So what was it that kind of sparked the journey of this novel for you, if you will?
So I've now done this a couple times, enough that friends are like, Idra, you're doing the thing again. And what I do is I was like, I'm going to write a nonfiction book because I love jumping genres. I've done translation, I've done poetry, I've done fiction. And I was like, I'm going to do nonfiction. And then I'll do interviews. And then all of a sudden, while I'm doing interviews on a subject that I'm curious about, I realize that the more interesting subject comes up naturally with people I'm talking to. Sorry, that's my dog, but someone will call him dad. And then what will happen after that is I'll hear anecdotes from people and realize that I can make like sort of a conglomerate and turn that into a better story by using my imagination, because I think ultimately that's, I definitely am interested in works of imagination, but drawn from complex realities, and so that really happened with this book. I was like, I was interested in going back to my hometown. My family's still there. My family's lived in the Allegheny Highlands for over 100 years. So, I went to the bar with my brother. I was like, seeing people from high school, people I grew up with. And I was like asking them about like shifts in our town, because we had like voted for Obama and then suddenly weren't voting for, the next candidate. And I was like, just like a big shift. But what really kept coming up was this question of estrangement, and that people said that it pained them that they weren't speaking to a neighbor. It pained them that they weren't speaking to one of their adult children. It pained them that they weren't speaking, to someone they grew up with because they saw something they said online and were appalled or angry or something like that. So it just kept coming up. And I just didn't see any books about that, and I had wanted for a while to write about, art that is relegated to folk art or relegated to regional art, and all art that's happening under the known surface of this country, which a lot of it is happening in Brooklyn, but
Yeah.
there's not the most interesting art isn't necessarily here. Some of it's derivative of other Brooklyn art, or it's imitating. I don't know. I mean, who knows? There's incredible artists everywhere. And I just thought that I wanted to start speaking. So I started speaking to some of the artists in my hometown, and two of them in particular, Norm Ed, who I wrote about for Orion magazine.
Mhm.
And his family is originally from Syria on his father's side, and his mother's family is from Russia, but they've been in this northern Appalachia for 100 years. And he gets discards and makes art and just keeps it in this like auto repair store that he and his wife Mary turned into a studio and a home, and they invite people over and do things. And so Gene's character is somewhat inspired by
Okay.
his work, and his just making incredibly high concept art for the joy of it, and not out of seeking a Guggenheim or a grant or any of those things. It's not about that. He's freed of that in some ways. And makes money doing other things. He was an art teacher. He like does kitchens. He has great carpentry skills. He just does other things. And then there's another woman who's very close to Gene's character, Helen Glubich, who became a friend of mine. And
Ooh.
she, like Gene, she worked at the local hospital in my town until that wing of the hospital closed. So she's probably the closest. And she takes cigar boxes and does collages on them, but she never looked for an audience. She just has them in her basement, and she started doing them after, the hospital wing closed and she didn't have a job. She just was drawn to make art and seek beauty. And I just found their relationship to beauty was like so rejuvenating and so different from sometimes the like operator feel
Yeah.
that can happen in cities,
I think there's insights on both ends of that, right? Like you were saying about how nobody needs to give you permission to be an artist. And then at the end of it, nobody needs to necessarily validate that you're an artist for you to be an artist. The validation is not what makes the artist, it's the practice. Am I?
Absolutely. And serious art,
Mhm.
because sometimes very silly art is validated, and very
Yeah,
serious
yeah.
art isn't. That correlation, it's not, the Venn diagram is actually a narrow overlap. So I think, in some ways we maybe, discount the power of how many people are doing incredibly serious and exciting art, under the known surface of what we consider, American art,
Without,
But yeah.
oh, sorry. Without digressing from your work too much, I just wanted, this is so perfect that you bring up folk art, because we've done stuff with our art center during the Sioux City Reads, and we've actually been working with another Brooklynite, Amanda Browder, who's an artist working on an installation piece here that's textile based. So she's been having a lot of conversations about folk art with folks who've been engaging with it a little bit more because of this book. So another great connection there, but that's just a digression that I wanted to share that I thought was kind of cool.
Very cool. And I think often because textiles are, cloth was often relegated to like something that women use,
Mhm.
or that like if you're using recycled material and discards, it's because you don't have access to like something else. But I think that that's changing. I mean, I think it's hard to make a case for making art out of new materials when like the amount of garbage we produce is
Right.
just astonishing at this point, there is Li Yang is a Chinese poet, and he said, I can't remember the name of his translator at the moment, but said, like we have devoted so much genius to production, but we haven't
Mm.
donated enough, human genius to what we do with our trash. And I wonder if this is the era where we will value artistic genius that's devoted to discards.
That
Like
is,
that will be an artistic value of our time.
yeah. What an interesting way to think of it, because I think we use like STEM terminology when we talk about solving that problem, not necessarily the terminology that we use with the humanities, but maybe that's a shift that needs to happen.
Yeah, we need all the genius we can get on the trash problem.
Amen to that.
Bring
Y-
all of our good brain, wherever they are. Yeah.
Speaking of brains, we're in the minds of two characters in this book.
Yes.
What was behind the decision to center a stepmother-stepdaughter relationship?
It's a great question. So, I'm very close to my stepmother and to my mother. So Leah is definitely not, a simulacrum of me. Although, of course, I did that drive many, many times
Okay.
back to, and so that, I wanted to write about that drive, about the gas stations. My husband's from Chile. We have a bilingual family. What I wrote in the novel is completely invented. I have never lied about any hatchets in the trunk yet, but but I also I that is, something that I have experienced is this, I sort of inhabit these two very polarized places. And
Yes.
I think that there's a way, in some ways, that, women artists or maybe, rural artists are often seen as sort of the step parents of art. They're not really given their due for what they contribute to art, not only in this country, I think, but often many places will sort of underestimate the influence of rural artists and sort of attribute things more maybe to some urban artists just because they're more visible or they're more in the wing of sort of like iconic people,
Right.
but often those works may be responding to things that people more off the grid. But I also just couldn't find any books that felt true to what I saw of the role my stepmother played in my life, and hearing her experience as a stepmother in a small town. And I just couldn't find any books about that. And I wanted to write about, how much we contributed to each other's lives,
Yeah. And you're right, because that's something that really struck me is I had never read a book that described a relationship like this. I thought it was like shockingly fresh. Like I was like, wait, I haven't read this. How is that possible? Like I haven't read this kind of relationship. How is a stepmother stepdaughter relationship dynamic like this never shown up in anything that I've read before? So I really liked that part of the book, I guess. Was there, you said that Leah's not necessarily an amalgamation of you,
Yeah.
right? Well,
And
what did you
yes. Yeah.
what did you pull from for the character of Leah versus Jean?
Well, I think what interested me about Leah is that her move when she comes back from Lima to New York hit at like a very different age and time than when I came back.
Okay.
In terms of like the Trump years and the pandemic,
Right.
like she's at a very different stage of life and is a
Right.
different person, and so I mean, I think I've been writing about Appalachia as a poet. I've been writing about rural places with the writers I translate. So I just think it's very many ways she's not me, but I see a lot of who I think are people who are from, I think that part of Appalachia who felt this need to apologize from where they were from. But the accident
Uh-huh.
of birth, nobody chooses where they're born, right? Or to whom. Nobody is responsible for where and how they're born. It's just, and that anyone should feel some sort of imperative to apologize. It's just, I don't know. So I see her experiencing that burden, of having
Yeah.
it hit her life at a time. And so she's sort of uneasy in one place and because I think Jean is home for her,
Right.
maybe the town isn't home, but Jean, her stepmother, is her home, is an emotional home for her.
Yeah.
And so they're estranged. She's estranged from her home because this woman raised her and taught her joy and taught her to be free and, like walk over duck shit, and
Right.
herself. And so like I think that and Jean also isn't, there's an intimacy she found with Leah that that's how she discovered art, was making art with Leah as
Right.
a role as a mother. So they're both missing the home they found in each other. So I think that was something I wanted to write about too. Like what do we lose in these estranged relationships? And that's not my wisdom. That definitely came from interviewing so many people
Mm.
who felt that the people they weren't speaking to was diminishing their days,
I've had so many conversations with people here in the Sioux City community and just kind of this area who have had similar experiences to that. And what Leah, that Leah's experiences kind of ring true for what I was experiencing when I was a New Yorker from Nebraska at one point. There is this weird, almost like a shame and a stigma tied to place where
Yeah.
we've take them into our personal brands and, how do we, to what extent is that home, or is home really just our family members? Like, what do I actually miss about
Well,
where
I
I grew up?
realized, yes, what do we actually miss? I mean, I think for me, it's both, and I
Hmm.
think it took me time to realize that, like, when I see certain hills, or certain woods, or hear certain sounds, or even certain like qualities of silence, I was like, oh, I feel so tied to this place,
Right.
and that it's still there, and like the trails are still there, certain like turns in the road, I feel it like deep in my bones, and so I think to have a deep connection to place is like a really beautiful thing, and I think that's often why people stay in place,
Right.
even if life gets harder, is because place is like a character. I mean, I wanted to
Right.
make that town a character because I think
It,
for me,
mhm.
it's like, the town itself has become like a force field, it's
Right.
how I think about things, what grows there, things like that.
and the perspective that Leah has on the town versus the perspective Jean has on it,
Yes.
I think
Yeah.
speaks a lot about who they are as people and what they're going through. I almost felt like the town was sort of a litmus test in some ways.
Oh, that's such an interesting way to think about it. Or almost like a Rorschach. And
Right. Like, what do
where like
you,
I think even though there's like, you know, the shut down mill, Jean can still perceive all the beauty around it.
right,
I think Leah, when she looks at the Rorschach of the town from a distance, all she sees is the emptiness, the building.
right.
She misses all the beauty. She's a little blind to it, you know, the way that like your mind can kind of zero in. And Jean really sees all that beauty, you know?
Yeah.
So
Leah has a lot of baggage she's taking on this trip, like a lot of preconceptions and a little, I struggled while reading this. I was like, is she projecting or is she right about a few things? Like the gas station scene. That
Yeah.
one really sticks with me. Can we talk about the gas station scene?
Yes, I would love to hear your take on it. Yeah.
Okay. So in that situation, I saw it as a moment for us to kind of check Leah a little bit. Like, she is coming from a very urban culture, returning with all these sets of ideas of what her hometown has become, and she's already anticipating the certain obstacles, so she's very ready for them.
Right.
And if anything, she might even be looking for them a little bit. And
She's a little primed. She's
a
primed.
little bit primed.
Yeah.
And because, you know, she is a woman in the time she's living, of course, she's a minority who's been victimized in certain ways, but she's also white. And in that situation, I think it was a moment for her to kind of check herself and realize that her actions could put her family in danger.
Yes. Yeah.
Because the way that her son and husband, or her child and husband, responded to it versus how ready she was, or talking about a hatchet, I'm like, I don't know if she had a different complexion, if she would have threatened a hatchet in the back of her car. I don't know.
Yes. And I also think she's grieving, right? So people, when they're grieving, they do crazy things. I think grief, you know, often brings out the wild side in people.
Right.
And I also think she's from there. So
Yeah.
she just feels like she can speak in shorthand,
Mm.
you know, even if her sense of the shorthand is just completely off because she hasn't lived there in a long time, you know?
Yeah.
I just feel like she's channeling Jean a little bit, but it's like she doesn't get Jean right, you know, like
Yeah.
she's a
They
little
have
off.
some personality similarities that are enacted in different ways that I found very like realistic to that kind of guardian child relationship where you're like, I'm never going to become you, and then you kind of become them, but in ways that look a little bit different.
Yes, yeah. It's funny this with my stepmom, she's very into monarch butterflies and like does all, we have like a very big, my hometown has like a whole thing where she raises them and then they go off to Mexico and it's just like a whole butterfly situation. She has all the things they eat, the milkweed, it's like you know, and all of that. And so when after my father died, she started bringing in all the monarch stuff into the house, and there's like chrysalises and nets, and like the living room was gone. And like part of me wanted to be like, you know, she was a little bit inspiration for Jean, not the art in many ways, very much the artist in my town, but just that relationship. And then I was like, I can't tell her that there's nowhere to sit down and eat. I wrote a book celebrating a woman who devoted her whole house to art. So who am I to tell my own stepmother that there's like too many butterflies in the house?
Yeah.
That's so inconsistent of me.
Yeah.
You know? And my kids were like, where should we eat? Nana's butterflies are everywhere. And I was like, well, it is Nana's house. She was living under Papa's house for many, many years. And if she wants to have chrysalises in every room, so be it.
And
It's
there's
her
a
house.
beauty to that. There's a beauty in people's kind of quirks and idiosyncrasies. Like, I think about the card that Jean sends Leah for the collage card, and I forget what she made it with, but it was something Leah read it as so inappropriate, right? Like, she
Right.
was like,
It was
what?
crotch shots and
That's what I got. Yeah.
frogs. Yeah.
And so Leah was like, what is this? But for Jean, that's how she's showing love,
Yes.
you
Yes.
know?
Yeah. And this woman who you know, she didn't send me any crotch shots, but the woman who did the collages would do this interesting mix of sort of like crass elements and
Yeah.
like the visual language of sort of Appalachia or like more rural places. And she would play with it, but then suddenly there'd be like a piano or a flute or something like that, you know?
Yeah.
And I think that those juxtapositions are so powerful, you know? And I think that if we don't get art from rural places, or, you know, then all of a sudden, like, our visual language and art is deprived, you know?
Yeah. It's like that whole danger of a single story idea
Yes.
that applies to art too.
Yeah.
And that's something I definitely was thinking about in this book, like all the artists across the country who like Jean, like what perspectives are not part of the canon.
So many, and there's a lot, you know, and I think it's funny how many I heard from a lot of sort of artists who are working with discards. And one of them, Jordan Tierney, whose work is incredible. She goes into the urban rivers of Baltimore and
Ooh.
like hauls up these things, and all of her art is made from feathers and like clothes that have been worn down. And she was like, I relate to Jean so deeply. And so she was like, I want to meet you. I want to meet the person who invented Jean. So we like did an event together in Baltimore, and we took, she got plastic bottles and we made something with the audience, which is, I love, sort of made me think a little bit about the mural that you made. And everybody took a plastic bottle. We made like a collective mural out of garbage from the rivers of Baltimore. And, it was fantastic. You know,
Yeah.
there's something very cathartic, almost spiritual, out of taking our garbage and making
Mhm.
it something, making art of it. Like it really
Yeah.
feels like a release, you know, it feels good.
Yeah, imbuing it with meaning and like trash to treasure is a cliche, but that's quite literally what that is.
Yeah.
Um, so we see a lot inside the headspace of Jean and Leah, but we don't go inside Elliot's head. And I guess I haven't brought him up yet. Elliot is, would you consider him like the third lead if there were leads?
Yes. I mean, I think the reason I didn't go into Elliot's perspective was that I really wanted to do this sort of like dialectic between the
Yeah.
two of them. You know, I was like, felt like the book was kind of like walking on the edge of a knife between the two of them in
Yes.
a way, you
Yes.
know, because it's like
Yes.
our country sort of has like somebody threw a knife in the middle of like a, you know, it's just so, there's something so violent about the divide.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I feel like this novel was like writing it very carefully on like the edge of that knife. And I think that Elliot, you know, it would have just taken out the intensity of their two perspectives
Right.
and their history. So artistically, I didn't think there's room. And I also don't know if I could, like, Elliot in some way has things in common with my brother, and also like a lot of sort of gentle, artistic guys that I grew up with and still in touch with. And, you know, when I was trying to do the audio for this book,
Hmm.
and I was listening to audio, and I kept hearing these like villainized voices from
Hmm.
like rural men. And I was like,
Yes.
caricature. It's so offensive, you know? And so I found with Appalachia, it's like a sort of amazing progressive podcast where they had these voices, and it was both like some that were like identified as gay young men in
Hmm.
Appalachia, some who maybe identified just as queer or whatever they're doing. And some of them didn't identify with anything, but were just interviewed on saying that like their voices didn't match up with the
Mm.
expected voice of men in the region, you
Wow.
know. And so I sent it to the woman who was doing the audio, and I listened to it myself and was just thinking like, wow, that voice is really missing from the voices that we think about in this country, you know?
Right.
So yeah, so that was something. Then I heard that, and that was like very helpful to think about. But I thought of Elliot as somebody who never felt like he could afford to take up all the air in the room. He didn't have a room,
Right.
you know, he didn't have a car. He did, you know, so he didn't feel like he could talk longer. He was never asked to. He was never given the
Mm.
space to be the one who rambles the way I do, you know.
I felt that like, well, listen, you're in good company then, because me too.
I'm a
But
rambler.
well, that's why you're a good writer. Um, well, with Elliot, I kind of appreciate as a reader, I liked that knife. I think you were successful in that tension of just focusing on the dialectic between those two relationships. And I liked Elliot as sort of like the uncertainty because I felt like I was reading him from two different perspectives. So I don't necessarily know Elliot. I know Elliot as Jean sees him, and I know Elliot as Leah sees him. And then between those two perspectives, as a reader, I kind of construct my own identity for him. I thought
Yeah.
that was interesting.
And I do think what we often, not many, or that women can, what comes between them could be a man in some ways, you know? And whether it's Leah's father and Jean's
Hmm.
ex-husband, is like this wedge between them is sort of their trying to cope with guessing with what some man in their orbit needs or wants,
Yeah.
and like anticipating how to respond. And there's like a lot of energy devoted to that. I felt
It's
like in
almost a
my
love
household.
triangle. I kind of thought of it. It's like
Yeah.
an unconventional love triangle and like more of a familial, it's like the maternal, but then there is the element of like the romantic sexual tension between Jean and Elliot. What was that?
Well, that sort of came to me over the course of the novel because I was just thinking, how many books have male artists inspired by young women, And it's always treated as this like, oh, those artists, they're a
Mm,
randy bunch,
yeah.
that's what they have to do. And I wanted to just subvert that and say, like, why, we're uncomfortable with the inversion of that. But I think that anyone can be on the losing end of an imbalance, a power imbalance, And
Mm,
there's so much of the dialogue and the Me Too era seemed to me to be, turning it into this gender thing, which often
mm,
it is, but actually all of us can sort of take advantage of someone depending on who is the power. And in Elliot's case, he doesn't have water, and
yeah.
he doesn't have food. And so, I just wanted to sort of subvert the way we think about that. But then there's other ways where he has the physical strength that Jean doesn't have. So it's complicated. And I think what I was most interesting to me was the way that Jean doesn't identify herself as someone as having any power, but she does leverage it over Elliot, you know?
That's true. She, yeah, if it's like she doesn't know her power. It's like not knowing her own strength, but everybody else is so aware of it. Like this reverence Leah has for her, the relationship Elliot has with her, and thinking about when Leah visits her and they're in the woods, that the situation on the cliff, they're both seeing Jean as the powerful person in that situation, but I don't know if Jean felt that or understood her own agency throughout the book. And I think it especially showed there. And then with her internal monologue regarding Elliot, I thought that was so fascinatingly written because I was on the edge of my seat. I did not want her to cave into temptation. I was so worried about her. And then it made me question some gender assumptions I have because I was like, I was thinking about kind of what you were saying about how many male artist characters I've read who have a young female muse and how that relationship often doesn't bat an eye, right? Like
Yes.
there's
Yeah.
just, it's not seen as necessarily like the same way it would have been seen had Jean followed through, right? There's like an element of the grotesque in there.
Well, there's something exploitative, and
Yeah.
that's exploitive that's happening there. And I think that, it's gross. Nobody should be leveraging that with somebody else's vulnerabilities. But I think we're more likely to sort of shift the paradigm and move it if we sort of just think of all the ways that, like, whether it's in a shadow economy where it's
Mm-hmm.
trading hands between neighbors because, if somebody has a record or, doesn't have a degree, or there's all these ways that they're sort of, end up their only source of income is through shadow economies where there aren't really rules for
Yeah.
behavior. And that's a vulnerable position to be in, and those power imbalances can, tip into something, and there is no name for it. And I think I saw that happening a lot, in my town. Like a lot of it was drawn from interviews about the women
Oh.
who work at the deli who don't have cars. Like, I think if you're certain places where there is no transportation, you don't
Mm-hmm.
have a car, you're very limited where you can work. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that can lead to other kinds of vulnerability. So I was just interested in all these kind of fraught kinds of vulnerabilities and how they sort of clash with each other, and also can lead to relationships, and friendships that we wouldn't have otherwise. Like, certain places, everyone who comes in the library, you have a love of books or an interest in books or a curiosity about ideas, and then people find each other. But it's kind of serendipity that Jean and Elliot find each other,
Mm-hmm.
and there's something beautiful about that too, of, when you just stumble into a connection you didn't anticipate.
And if I'm remembering correctly, like the moment for me at least, the big moment of connection was kind of brought about when she almost saws her leg right off.
Yes.
That first day when they're working in the workshop and she has the saw out and she's like, oh, it's no big deal, da 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 da. Kind of another instance of Jean not being aware of power where it is in the room, literally a power tool in this instance.
Literally, she's holding a power tool. Yeah.
Right. And there was something very intimate about that that is, I don't want to get like gross here, but almost more intimate than a sex scene would have been in my head. There's still like body fluids, a trip to the hospital, and seeing a side of somebody that you wouldn't normally see. But I thought that was a more beautiful way to show intimacy than, you know, a cut and dry sex scene would have been. I liked that. I think
I
it's so
love that. I love seeing it as the alternative sex scene. That's
or it kind of like,
you're right, because it's a lot of bodily contact. He's
yeah,
holding her, you know, he's like, you know, there's all these bodily ways that they're like, she's like a pieta, she's like in, in his arm,
yes,
there's like,
yes,
I was thinking about all of that, but I think you're right. I wanted to get it like all of those things where it's like, there's no words exchange, that everything
Mhm.
that's said between them are like these moments between people that are like beyond language. And I think of that as something that we want from visual art too, that it's beyond words. It's like its
Yeah,
own language. And I do think sex has its own language that doesn't,
right,
not that people can't chat all the way through, but there's other ways to communicate.
right, yeah. And I think capturing it on the page is not easy, but I think that's something that you did very successfully with this book.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for reading it with such depth and care. I feel like you really, really, you sort of latched on to many of the things that were important to me when writing
Oh,
it.
well, good. I'm glad to hear it. I'm glad we're able to talk about it. That makes me think of the flip side of it then. What was the robbing? Why okay. Was he part of the group that robbed Jean?
I think he was there. Yeah.
I do too.
Yeah. Yes.
So
I'm seeing
like
the other readers on are also got this. Yes.
so
Yeah.
like we go from this act of intimacy, and that's like a betrayal of intimacy, but the way it reminded me of Les Mis at the beginning when he steals the candelabra and the priest is like, you need this more than me, sort of take what you need, if you will, right? Like, I
Right.
think it's so interesting that Jean wasn't necessarily worried about really getting to the bottom of whether or not he was in there or not.
Yeah, it's funny that you brought up the priest and I was bringing up Pieta because I take what you need comes from that part in the Bible where it's about honey, saying that you shouldn't take more honey than you need, lest it will make you vomit. And
Ooh,
that taking more than you need, there's the proverb about, I'm not getting it quite right, but that was part of where I got it from, was this notion that when you take more than you need, it not only means that other people, there isn't honey for others, it makes you sick,
oh.
you can't eat too much honey. Not that my children care. They like put so much honey in their tea. I was like, do you want any water in there with the honey? It's like, your teeth are gonna rot out. They're like, but it's natural. Anyway, and I think that is the funny thing about things that seem natural, but you can still be gluttonous,
Yeah,
and
right. Natural
take it.
is not a synonym for good.
No, or excess. There can still be excess to it. But I think what I was thinking about Elliot is like, he's hungry, he's back on drugs, like there's
Uh-huh.
all these things. And, somebody can both commit a crime and be worthy of compassion.
Yes.
Somebody can do something that is terrible and then not be on drugs or be in another place in life and be the one who brings you exactly what you need for your sculpture.
Right.
Same person,
Right.
it can be the same person, and if you're not open to that person changing, then you lose out on them that possibility. So
Yeah. That's
yeah.
you're kind of making you're giving me a lot of food for thought. I'm like thinking about like the compassion she showed him by not like trying to prosecute or anything, how much she got in return from that we saw that she wasn't planning on.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I taught for a long time in a women's correctional facility through the Bard Prison Initiative. And it was, I had to go through all these beeping doors to teach there, but it was interesting
Mhm.
because I was teaching at Columbia, which is sort of like this tornado of privilege,
Yeah.
and then I would, teach my students who are all in, these green uniforms and,
Mm.
were stuck in, and what their life experiences were. But then things would happen that were really powerful. And, I remember those conversations more than the ones at Columbia. They have completely left me. But I had one student, we read Elizabeth Bishop poem, The Art of Losing. Do you know that
Mhm.
poem?
Not
Losing things isn't hard to master. It goes, anyway, it's all about like she was sort of convincing herself that there is an art to losing things.
mhm.
And one of my students was like, oh, is she an alcoholic or did she live with an alcoholic? And I was like, she was an alcoholic.
Mhm.
And my student was like, yes, because that's that's the kind of thing one would say, you know, she could see it almost as like a mantra to oneself, you know, that, and so that connection was like drawn from life experience, but also the bravery to say that and recognize that connection. And
Yeah,
I've never read that poem the same way, you know?
right.
And so I think for Elliot, you know, the fact that maybe he had experiences with drugs or all of those things, that doesn't mean that he can't then give the most illuminating feedback to Jean, you know, about her
Mhm.
art. Like he really gets
Right.
what she's doing, and he is an incredibly open-minded person. Um, and you
Yeah.
never know who in your neighborhood might be open-minded.
Yeah, I love the type of unconventional mentor-mentee relationship. In some of our discussions, we were comparing it to almost like a Harold and Maude type relationship.
Oh,
We
that's
don't,
great. I love that.
you know, and those exist in real life, but we don't often find them in our fiction or on our screens or in our books. So I really liked the ways they showed intimacy, and I think at the end too, you kind of at the beginning we know that he was the one who contacted Leah, but then at the end you kind of understand the meaning of that, and
Yes.
that he is sort of the catalyst to the entire narrative, because if he hadn't reached out to Leah, what would the story be?
Sometimes it takes a neighbor, you know?
Yeah.
You need a neighbor to make things happen in your own house. I mean, I think I was thinking that, you know, about sometimes when there's an estrangement between people that they can't get over the impasse,
Mm-hmm.
you know, out of pride, out of sorrow, out of grief,
Right.
out of fear, you know, out of everything. And sometimes it like takes a third person because and also, you know, Elliot, you know, he doesn't have anything to lose with the art, but he's come to value it. He knows how much work went into it.
Yeah.
He knows all the creativity and the risks and all, you know, how like gathering all those pieces and smashing the mirrors, and he's invested in the artwork, you
He's
know?
really innovated as part of it too. Like he, you know, like the what were the bullets part of, he helped her shoot the gun into the artworks to do like the riddle it with the bullets and the dents like that. Like he innovated with alongside her at some parts.
Yeah, and that was fun too for me because I would call up Normed, this art in my the artist in my town, and I would be like, now if you were going to be shooting a sculpture, what would be an easy to come by gun? And he like knew immediately, you know? And he was like, the best thing to do would be to lie the sculpture down so you would be shooting into the ground at it. And I
All
was like,
right.
of course, yeah, but it was like an artist practical mindset about
Yeah.
like how to shoot your sculpture, and I, you know, it was so
Like,
it was great, you know. And then he became a close friend because he was so, you know, wrapped up in it. It was funny, when I did a reading in my hometown, his daughter came and she said
mhm.
she related to Leah, and that one day she was like, I'm gonna look you up because you're gonna have to help me find a home for my father's art. So I like, you know, she saw herself in this story, you know, of Leah's feeling of sense of you know, responsibility for her
Yeah.
stepmother's art, and Nellie was anticipating that for her father's art, which is brilliant. And I'm already starting now to try and
Well,
try and find a home for it. Yeah.
that's kind of I love that, because that was something that I think I was kind of taking from the story as well, of like what role do we play in building out the canon? Like nobody gives you permission to be an artist, but also like nobody's giving you permission to be a cure, you know, like you can curate without being a curator. You can, I don't know, there's ways to do that, to put eyeballs on things, even if it's not at, you're not the New York Times book review, but you can at least be word of mouth, you know. There's always
Yeah.
ways that we can bring things a little bit closer into the zeitgeist or the mainstream, whatever the goal is.
Yeah. And I think when I came to this book, you know, you know, Ways to Disappear, my first novel, starts in Pittsburgh, and then,
Hmm.
you know, a writer translator leaving. And this book was very much coming back into the same airport, you know, in a way,
Yeah.
the back, I mean, not to Pittsburgh itself, but the, you know,
Right.
driving west from there. Is that I think that, well, as a translator, it's like sort of you know, there's writers I wanted to champion, and there was like a writer who lived in the swamplands, the Pantanal, which is in the north of Brazil. His name is
Yeah.
Manuel de Barros, and I think I related to his poems about rural Brazil, even though it's very different flora and fauna. But he was writing about knowing so deeply these like bugs and creatures and sounds of this place that was being emptied out because people were going to Rio, they were going to Sao Paulo, they were
Oh,
going to Manaus. And so people were leaving to find jobs in other places. And so the town itself was emptying out. And then some of the houses were covered with like vines and fungus were taking over the houses, you know? So at the time, I didn't think about myself being drawn to a rural artist in an emptying place because he was here, he was in, you know, like the sort of like, you know, wetlands of Brazil. But I think
mhm.
that's why his work spoke to me. And,
Yeah.
you know, and I wanted to bring him back to the US because I was like, this is somebody who's watching people leave where they are.
Uh-huh.
And, you know, what is that? We need that imagination. We need somebody talking about that, you know, about the urbanization that's happening all over the planet. It's happening everywhere.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm glad you brought up your translation work because you reminded me of a question that we had. When I was upstairs talking with the folks who are watching here at the library, they did want to know more about that side of you. Like, how did you get into translation and without, getting too far away from take what you need, I guess. Where'd
What
you come
happened?
across? Yeah, what happened?
I know everyone's like, why is this girl from Johnstown, Pennsylvania, end up, you know, translating poets from the wetlands of Brazil? I mean, it's funny. Cesar Vallejo, you know, reading his translations that happened by James Wright. You know the poet James Wright, who's from
Yes.
Ohio. And so James Wright has that famous poem that's in a stadium in Ohio. And then his poems got stranger after he started translating Vallejo and translating South American poets. And so James Wright, like seeing what he wrote about Ohio, and then seeing what happened when he started thinking about people's imagination and writing about things in other places. And then he brought it back to Ohio, you know? And I think he
Wow.
infused his poems about the Rust Belt with these sort of images and language and approach to poetry that was totally from another place. And I think that really appealed to me, you know, to do that because we weren't reading anything that was like anywhere where I grew up. Like one book that really stood out to me when I read in college was Pedro Páramo by Juan Rulfo. And it was like this anarchy. I mean, Pedro Páramo was just retranslated actually. I haven't read the new translation. I mean, I've read it many times in Spanish. I love that book. And at one point I wanted to do a Pedro Páramo set in Appalachia, you know, because I was
Yeah.
like, you have these like landless things. There's like a guy in a horse. He like assaults whoever he wants. There's no consequences for it. Then there's like everyone trying to, you know, do some sort of wonderful life, but don't, be careful with that man on the horse, you know, because there are no consequences. Like there's something about that that just really, I could recognize something that I knew, you know, I haven't done that yet, but there was a way that like I would find little pieces of things that I couldn't find in what I had been served of American literature, like the
Mhm.
diet I was on. And so I just saw it in other places, I think, you know, in
You're-
Clarice Lispector, you know, things like that.
I like the diet metaphor. Like, that's like you need to have a little bit of everything on your plate. And those
Yeah.
perspectives get lost if there aren't translators who are, helping other people experience that poetry in the work. That's
Yes,
very
I was
cool.
like, you're missing the vitamin of Clarice Lispector in your diet. You know, you need
Yeah.
you're
And
really
and then I think maybe what I was hearing is in that translation process too, like you hit upon things that aren't being communicated in the English language that need to be communicated, and how do we do that
yeah.
too?
Yeah, I think it's, you know, I forget who said it, but the translation's a window. And when you
Mm,
open it, you let some stale air out and you also get some fresh air in. It kind of goes both ways, you know, and I think that's true of Jean and Elliot's relationship. Like they both needed a window, you know?
yeah,
Jean got some of her isolation, you know, that air, she needed to get that out and some fresh air for Elliot. You know, I think that that can happen with literature. It's like very much you need to open a window and get something like a lot of American literature can start to sound similar.
yeah.
Like you got to bring in a breeze, but also, you know,
Cleanse your
um,
palate.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Stir up
Um,
papers on the desk, you know?
I wonder, yeah, and if only you could see the desk that is just barely off camera and all the papers that are already stirred up. Um, gosh, you've got me thinking about maybe like there's a lot of miscommunication in this book. And I think you write it so well. And I wonder if that's because of your work as a translator. Um, because although Leah and Elliot and Jean are all speaking in the same language, we see a scene like when they're all at the cliff and they're all speaking the same language, but they're not all saying the same thing
No.
and they're not hearing the same things.
Oh, that's brilliant. Wow, but that is amazing insight. You're
The
absolutely
scene is, well, the scene is
yeah.
brilliant. How did you write that?
Well, I lived a version of it and
Okay.
sleep afterward. Not with my stepmother, but just, and it was, you know, until you said that, I think that's what it was. There was a way that everyone was talking, but the like all of the unsaid, the subtext, and like what,
Mm-hmm.
you know, was what you're right. It was like several different, you know, people were speaking, but there was like people were just registering the conversation in such different ways. And
Mm-hmm.
yes, and another time I went out to that same cliff and like a policeman showed up and said that he liked like surprising people on the cliff, and I was like, that's it's crazy. You know,
Cliff
anyway,
is not
so
a good place to surprise people.
what? You know, so I've had, you know, so that came out of like visiting this, like, you know, Devil's Rock in my town a bunch of times. I just was like, it's a very cinematic, it like was asking to be sort of, you know, mythologized in that way, I guess, you know, in my little tiny Idra mythology. I mean, what, I don't even know what that means, but, you know, in my own little mythological universe in some way. But I think that's a really astute take on what happens there, because I think people have different high alerts. Like what sets off my alert buttons is so
Mm-hmm.
different than what sets other people's alerts. Like, you know, and it depends on the media you consume. It depends on where you live. And like
Mm-hmm.
you know, my alerts go off on a cliff like that. But interesting, like my husband who grew up in the Pinochet dictatorship in Chile,
Wow.
went into a beach town, and I never saw him get so stiff, and we drove out of the town immediately, and I was like, that looked like a great place for lunch. And
Mm-hmm.
he was like, oh no, those are all military people, we have to get out of here, you know, and just left. And I was like, but that was like 20 years ago. And he's like,
Yeah.
"We'll not be eating lunch there, we are out." And it was like, it was not a conversation, he was not,
Yeah.
he was out of there, you know, and had friends who, you know, had to go into exile, and his own father. And there's just so much there. His high
Right.
alert button, he saw, I don't even know what he saw because I didn't register it, but his
Yeah.
alert went off, you know, and when
Right.
he was on the cliff and the policeman came, he thought that was, he didn't think there was any need to leave. I
Mm.
was like, fire alarm.
Yeah.
So I just feel like I think in many ways I've just learned that like what sets our alert buttons off, your orange alert or whatever alert, it's just so particular to your lived experience.
Right. And I think Jean's lived experience at that time is why she was like facing towards Elliot more in that situation,
Yes.
because she was approaching it like very penitently. It felt like she was overcompensating for this internal, like, mind you, she really didn't act on these things, but she had all this guilt from an internal experience that didn't hurt anyone, which I thought was also something I was like, oh, I don't read about too much that. I don't know if I've read a story where the male artist is that worried about, the consequences of his actions and then feels guilt thereafter. So I thought that was there was something there that really struck me, how much she cared about just these thoughts she had, to the point where it caused more trouble. And that was the part that really kind of broke my heart for Jean, because here she is thinking that she's going to have this great reconnection with Leah, and it seems to be going that direction. And then she's trying to solve problems with both people, and she can't do them both at the same time in the same place. And she's just doing her best, and it's being misread by everybody. So my heart really went out to her.
Oh, well, I just love that she came alive for you that way, and you were so attuned to all these complexities in her character. That observation about everyone on the cliff is like that will stay with me. What a gift! Thank you,
Well,
Michael. I love
well,
that.
thank you for writing it. I couldn't observe it if it wasn't written. What do you think they could have done differently in that situation to like not cause this alienation, to not cause the acrimony and the tension?
Yeah. I mean, I think jumping to snap conclusions or knee-jerk
Mm-hmm.
reactions. But I do think that when things in the larger sphere feel precarious, it's hard to give people the benefit of the doubt. You have to feel pretty
Mm-hmm.
secure in order to constantly be a source of goodwill. And, you know, I mean, I think people lapse into caricatures sometimes of
Yes.
themselves, or also sort of flatten other people, maybe out of fear, could be also out of laziness. I mean, there's many reasons that that happens. And it's hard to always summon the more generous self, you
Mm-hmm.
know? Um, but I do think that it makes for better days when you do. You-
Yes. Yeah. You play with that idea of people being flattened.
Yeah.
like it conceptually, and you play with stereotypes a lot in this book.
Yes. Yeah.
Is
I
that
do. Yeah. There was one writer I saw online who I like is in person, is very kind, smart person, talented, but was like, I don't care whether what was, I don't even remember what the name was. It was like Janet in Cleveland reads my book or not.
Oh,
Like, but what if Janet in Cleveland is the best reader you'll never have? Because
right.
you can't write off anyone based on where they live or what their name is. You don't
Yeah.
know where your sharpest, most insightful reader is. And Janet may be doing the best art you'll never see. You know, like
Right.
I just sort of
Right.
feel like we can't make assumptions that way. You
Yeah.
know, it just diminishes our lives to do so.
Right. And I think this story shows the harms of when you make those assumptions and when you meet people as stereotypes versus as individuals.
Yeah.
I think that's the source of so much trouble in the story. Even like, you know, the back to the gas station, that interaction Leah had, like she could have just got gas and ignored the lady and moved on, you know, like how, like,
Yeah. I mean, I think the thing is, when I was trying, it was like, because, you know, Leah has a dark side. It was funny. A lot of people reading, responding to the book were like, well, I don't like Leah. And I was like, it's okay. She is not likable. Like it was about, you know, asking these questions and, you
she's
know,
human.
yes, exactly. And scared, you know, and
Yeah.
projecting or not, her alerts went off. She's grieving and she's acting like a screwball. You know, it happens, it happens to many people. I
Well,
see it all the time
I
myself.
recognize myself in her, like full transparency. When I moved back to the Midwest after spending a long time living in New York, I was coming back here much like with a similar perception of my surroundings as Leah. And in some cases, was I correct? Absolutely. But oftentimes, like the stereotypes I was holding on to and fearing were doing more harm to me than anyone actually was, you know?
Which is what Jean was trying to say to Leah on the cliff.
Right. Like who's hurting you in this
Right.
moment?
Yes.
Like, where is the pain coming from?
At the same time, when I read in my hometown, one guy stayed after and said that he was like, what would have been said on that cliff was far worse than what you wrote. And another
Oh.
guy who came to the reading said to me, every time I go to a gas station, I imagine things happening like that
Yeah.
what you were, it was like that his, imagination just goes. So, and these were strangers who just came up to me and said that. So it was really like trying to figure out like, how to be true to the book, how to raise questions, stay on that like edge of the knife without, I wanted to, hold back and let the reader just inhabit the scenes. I don't think fiction should tell people how to feel or think. I think it should just immerse you in a world. And then the reader is left puzzling it and asking these questions. So it's very validating here, because I think when a book is like trying to telegraph to me who I should identify with or what I should feel, I know I was like, you want to write for your best reader, your most intuitive, insightful reader who,
Yeah.
dot to dot.
Well, it was nice to read a book where I wasn't focusing on someone necessarily as antagonist or protagonist. There didn't need to be a villain. It was like they all were people and I related to them and disliked them all at different points throughout the book, much like the real people in my life.
I was just gonna say, like, all my relatives.
Right.
Who I love.
Right. And so I think like that also helps make the characters feel real, because sometimes I tell people what I think they should think, but I'm not always walking around doing that and telegraphing my exact feelings. So I liked that ambiguity, and I wish more authors would play with that a little bit more.
Thank you. I read a lot of Claire Keegan when I was working on this book. I think she's very good at that. Do you know the Irish writer, Claire Keegan?
Claire Keegan. I've heard of Claire Keegan.
Yes.
I have a lot of Irish writers on my mind right now.
Foster, it's like 90 pages. It's so clean. She never, ever, yes, it's a wonderful book. You can read it like in, one evening, or, for me, one subway ride, one thing when you're saying it's
Amen
really
to that.
yeah. And small things like these, I just think it's very clean. She it's written in Ireland, which is a very polarized country, but she never sort of tells anyone, she just stays in the scene and holds back and lets the reader sort of intuit their own. She trusts the subtext, and there's very beautiful stories about things that are fraught. There's very fraught intimacies that she's writing about, but she doesn't, she trusts that the reader will get it. And of course you do. There's an immediacy to that because it pulls you out of a scene. I think when the writer tells you what to feel.
I agree.
The spell a little bit.
Yeah, I think it takes a lot of discipline to not do that too, right? I would guess. Like you kind of, like to hold back, I think it takes more discipline to create those nuances by holding back a little bit or not
Yes, it
showing
does.
every card. And that makes me wonder, like, when did you know you were done?
Oh, I still edit sometimes at reading. I mean, I probably wrote 1,000 pages for the 250 that are in this book, but I mean, I come from poetry. So I'm, I'm okay with throwing out a page and starting again. When I tell my students that, they're like, well, what should I revise? And I was like, you need to open a new document and anything that's worth keeping will come up naturally in the new draft. And they're just horrified by this. But I was like, sometimes that's easier than, trying to move, cut and paste, then it just ends up being like a document technological exercise instead of,
Right.
like if it's worth staying, it'll come up again in the new draft and you can always go back to the other document and open it. But
Right.
yourself the like tabula rasa, like just see what stays with you. And so I did that a lot. I would start chapters over again.
That's so interesting because that is like the words that you were using to describe Claire Keegan were the words that I was using to describe this book at the
Oh,
beginning of Sioux City Reads. And I really do mean that. I thought it was very like tight and I was impressed with that restraint because I think I like to take it and to hear it, it makes sense that you spent 1,000 pages, because I think that level of attention and detail was condensed into the novel that we have before us. So that's cool to hear about all of that going into it. And I think we have a lot of writers just watching right now who will really enjoy that insight into the revision and the editing process.
Oh, well, I'm happy to take questions if anyone has any
Oh
questions.
yeah. And we
Yeah.
have the chat open.
Yes, if anyone
So
wants
I'll
to.
have as well.
Porter
We see.
Sculpture Park, I'm gonna say.
Oh yeah, Dagna mentioned the Porter Sculpture Park in Montrose,
No,
South Dakota.
I'm definitely gonna check it out. That's totally up my alley.
Yeah, I think you would love driving through the state of South Dakota and find there's a lot of making art where they are. People
Oh,
making art where they are. I the phrase folk art has such a stigma to it for no reason. I always don't know if it's condescending to call it folk art, but I suppose that's what the world at large would label it. But yeah, highly recommend checking that out. Yeah, there's artists everywhere. And towards the end of the book, you talk about how those artists are found, which kind of made me think about how they're lost as well.
yes, yes. And this book I hope, was an invitation to imagine the art we don't get to see. I feel very haunted by the art that's lost to us.
Mhm.
And just imagining it and being open to that. I think it's that's where imagination steps in, and I think that can happen with books too. Now, and there's obviously tons of amazing art that exists. It does exist, but there's not as much time to see everything, you want to see in your lifetime, but it's also wonderful to be open to the chance that you might be driving through South Dakota and see art that, stays with you for the rest of your life. You just never know where it'll be.
And I think there's something really precious about art that you don't necessarily see every time you turn on the History Channel or every time you open a magazine or a coffee table book. Like everybody knows what the Mona Lisa looks like. I could probably do my best drawing it from memory, but there's a lot of art out there that gains a precious quality just solely by the fact that people aren't seeing it.
Yes.
I think like.
Yes. Yeah. Right. That it hasn't become a meme.
Right. We live in an age where images become memes so quickly that how do you like create scarcity anymore? Like think about 2 years ago with NFTs. Like what would Gene have to say about NFTs? Like
or like the AI generated art, which is so flat. And once
right.
like 10 images, you can see them immediately, and sometimes you see things up on Instagram of people sharing their art that way, and it can be tremendous art, but then it's sometimes thinking about people are anticipating the larger audience and not the people where they are, which changes the way you go about things, Yeah, it's a very fascinating time for our relationship to place, because there's always this place where everybody is online.
Right.
But it also makes it possible for me to meet with all of you. So that's
yes. It's such a mixed bag. Oh my gosh, my thought just flew out of my head. Online. Oh, the laptop. Jean doesn't replace her connection to the outside world after it's stolen.
I dream of this. Not that I want anyone to steal my laptop. I'm holding on to it for dear life. I have to teach tomorrow. I should probably get off soon.
Listen, you better keep it until at least March 30th.
Yes, but yes, but I do think there's a way where she is open to the possibility of serendipity.
Uh-huh.
In her art, in her life, and I do think there's something freeing about it. I mean, I think like Jean is like a better self. I mean, in some ways, many things she does that are totally bananas, but I missed her company when I finished the book because I got to grant her behaviors that I feel like I can't do in my life, but wish I could.
Yeah.
Some days,
Such
sure
as?
like I don't mind if the whole day goes by and I don't go outside. I don't mind at all,
Yeah.
I think I just grew up in a rural place where like that was just like that just happens, It's okay, like my husband, grew up in Chile where people just, he knew all the neighbors, people just went out, like that wouldn't be a thing that they would do. And he was like, you didn't go outside today. And I was like, no need, I'm perfectly happy. I have so many books. What am
Right.
I?
I'm like, well, you're comfortable.
Yeah, I have pickles, I have peanut butter, I have books. I don't need to leave the house. There's nothing, at least for a day or two, then I do need to go outside. But yes, I'm happy to hunker down like there's like a snowstorm on a mountain outside. And I'm fine.
Maybe so Jean is more adventurous than you maybe in certain ways, but she never went to visit Leah, did she?
That's true. That's yes.
She never
did that journey. Yeah.
As I was reading this book, I was kind of also imagining the inverse to this book, where the story is Jean is going to Manhattan or Brooklyn because something's happened to Leah.
Oh,
what happens then?
I love that. I love that you imagine the inverse and how maybe things would play out, similar projections. Yeah.
I like, who would Jean meet on her way into Manhattan that gives her a New York once over and goes, like versus the gas station situation? Like, what's the stereotypical like urban coastal elite that she would run into?
Yes. Well, so my friend Helen Golubich, who is a brilliant artist and also writes poetry, which she doesn't feel any need to send out anywhere. I wrote a poem about her for poetry that came out in the November issue of Poetry. And she just writes her poems and sticks them in a drawer. And that issue of Poetry, the call was people who've influenced your poetry. So I wrote in and I was like, can it be someone who's a poet who influenced you, but who never published? And Sharif Shanahan, who was editing it, was like, absolutely. I don't care whether they're published or not. You can have a poet whose work inspires you, who's never published, of course, So I wrote about Helen and she did come to visit me in New York, and she didn't wear a bra and she had her hair's white. She wears it in braids on the side. And she commented loudly on the people on the sidewalk. And then at the end of the day, she's like, oh, I can't wait to get out of here, Idra. I love you, but I'm ready to go.
That's hilarious.
Yeah, she was just like too many, uppity people with like $1,000 strollers and everything. She was like, I'm heading back to, she picks her watercress by the river. She, has her tomatoes. She was like, loves her flea markets. And I do think like when I go to the flea markets, I would go with her to flea markets and I would find something that I thought was, inventive at the flea market. And she would say to me, oh, Idra, that's derivative. You can find that at all of them. Put it back.
That's great. Now I'm because I'm definitely probably more Leah oriented. Like I would be the one who's like scared on the cliff and fine in the city,
Right.
But yeah. I'm like imagining a scene where Leah has Jean come with her onto a subway car that Jean doesn't want to get on, and Jean's uncomfortable in the subway car, and Leah's like, it's fine, it's fine, it's fine. I know these people. Like there's everybody's a fish out of water somewhere.
And you're right. Her high alerts may go on in a place where Leah doesn't. Yes. I love that. Wow. Michael, what a sharp reader. This is such a gift. Illuminating.
You are going to give me a big head if you're not careful. And so
and thank you all for being such a great audience, seeing you smile and laugh and respond. This is really a delight. Thank you.
Yes, thank you all. So we're at the end of our conversation tonight, but we are so lucky because Idra will be joining us again in roughly a month from today. So on March 30th, we'll all gather at the Art Center downtown, and we'll see you on the big screen. And at that time, we will invite all of you to kind of bring your questions. So between now and then, if you haven't had a chance to pick up Take What You Need, I really hope that listening to this discussion has inspired you to do so. I really recommend it. I think this book packs such a punch and has something in it for every kind of reader. I really do think there's a window into the story for anyone. So highly encourage you checking it out, giving it a read, and joining us again on March 30th, where we will continue the discussion and you know, see what questions we come up with in the meantime.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you all. It was
Yes,
great.
thank you, Idra. This has been wonderful. Thank you so much. And we'll see you next month. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.